Hey, podcast listeners, welcome back to the Gen AI and Education Podcast. I'm Julie, and today we're super excited to have Jon Fila joining us. John's been an educator for over 20 years, has taught a variety of subjects and grade levels, and much of his work has focused on blended and online learning, accessibility, curriculum writing, and digital delivery and design. He was a finalist for the Minnesota Teacher of the Year in 2022 and has been recognized by a variety of state and national organizations for innovation in teaching. So, John, hey, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining us.
All right, thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
So, why don't you start us off just by telling us a little bit about why generative AI matters in education and why education matters to you?
Maybe I'll just start with why it matters to me and then jump on to that
Love it.
first part. In my own experience, my personal experience, and what drove me into education as a profession is that I really believe that education is a mechanism for generational change. So, for example, if there's a student that's been struggling with algebra, one of the most failed classes in the country, if not the most failed. That could go in a couple of ways for that student, right? They could continue to struggle and fail, and maybe they get to college where that course would have served as a gatekeeper for them, but they eventually passed and got through. Or maybe there's a requirement for developmental math class. So I've heard up to 80% of students who take developmental math classes in college drop out. They're paying for courses that they don't earn credit for. They're not getting the support they need. But with the right interventions, that student could receive the necessary support to learn those topics, pass the class, move on, earn a degree, not only improve their lives, but the lives of the children, their children, or their children's children. So we know a really big indicator of success is tied to the highest degree attained by one's mother. And I speak to that in my own family experience as well. Um, when I think about generative AI in that context, it allows us to make sense of very complex topics and draw conclusions, right? It's about having a conversation with our data and with our information in ways that we couldn't before. We could look something up and read it, but the conclusions that generative AI reaches when I'm having conversations with these tools isn't really what I find all that useful. And I think that's what can turn a lot of people off. They see the responses, they think, it's okay, that's clever, but it's not really useful. But what I find useful is that ability to have the conversation and develop my own insights and strategies
Mhm.
around what I'm doing. So because of my interactions with it, it's actually prompting me then to come up with solutions, not the other way around. So by me asking it questions, I rarely go with a large language model response, but it's that collaborative effort that I feel like gets my brain thinking of at least what I don't want, and then it shifts me into thinking what I do. So that's why I think it matters that we have this new ability to just develop new relationships
Hmm,
with information.
interesting. I appreciate that perspective. And much has been made of the sort of augmentation of humans by AI. And so that collaborative approach, one, is aligned to, I think, a lot of the work we've been trying to do in school systems for a long time. But two, I think it's aligned to like an antidote to some of the concerns that people have around outsourcing too much to AI. So I definitely appreciate that. What
We live in a very or we work in a very, like, isolated field. If I'm an English teacher, and how often in the last 25 years of my career do I really get to sit down and talk with other English teachers? It's rare. So having a tool at my disposal to just have these kinds of conversations with, of course, it's not as good as if I was speaking to another educator of 25, 30, 40 years, or even a new educator with a fresh perspective, but it's more
Yeah.
than I had before.
Yeah, I know. It's really interesting. And one of the things that I worry about is I totally see that, right? I totally see how people are using LLMs, and I do this too, as a thought partner to reduce some of that loneliness and isolation that you're talking about. And my concern is if some of those connections aren't present in us as humans to begin with, or we're not motivated to continue to seek them out, like I worry about that from a social perspective, right? So I wonder if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, we have to think about why we're doing this work. What's it about? If my focus is
Mhm.
on my learners and I'm going to be the one interacting and engaging with them, it is useful even to have an AI thought partner for me to just get my own
Mhm.
thoughts in order. to really do some troubleshooting on my own before I just put something in front of them. And I can workshop things in ways that I haven't been able to before because I can ask it questions about what I'm
Mm,
about to do and perspectives it might see or patterns it might see in how I'm delivering something, or maybe give me some different ideas about what that could look like. I teach in an asynchronous online environment, which is incredibly difficult to generate or build relationships with students is in. So I work really hard at trying to find ways to connect with my students because they're also isolated on the other side. So they need to feel like there's somebody that's actually guiding them and providing feedback and coaching through the
mm,
courses that I write.
yeah, absolutely. What about you talk a little bit about the journey and how you've used AI to build some of those relationships. What about your personal journey with generative AI? Like what has that been like for you and has that evolved over time?
So I remember November, December 2022, starting to see these really weird student submissions start to come in. And I'm maybe 4 or 5 times a year. I teach primarily seniors, and I would see these perfectly formatted papers start to pop up in the submission boxes that I wasn't really used to more than a few times a year. And then we heard about this thing called ChatGPT, and so a couple colleagues and I were talking about it and we were playing around. They were playing around a little bit, right? So the first, I would say, week and a half since they were talking about it, I went to the website and looked into it. And then when I saw I had to put my phone number in to get an account, I shut that tab in my browser. I was just like, why do they need my phone number? I don't like that. And then I thought, like, nothing, like, we've already sold our privacy, right, to all these other tools and systems, and my phone number is the least of the things they know about me, and we used to be in the phone books anyway, so it really wasn't that big a deal. So I put it in, got an account, and I started playing around with it. And what I started doing was just quickly like tweaking prompts to get a different kind of response because they weren't great in the beginning, but my students thought they were good enough to get by. And then I failed and failed and failed because every time a student submitted it, I got a little bit confrontational about it. I would say, this is AI, do it again. I'd reset their submission. And then I worked a couple times, but then what happened was I got a student who said, no, it isn't. I didn't use ChatGPT for this. And then, yeah, I knew it. I knew they did. It had a lot of the hallmarks of that type of writing. And then their parent got involved and said, no, I watched them writing and they didn't use ChatGPT, but I was 100% sure. Then what do you do? What do you do when there's that kind of denial to that confrontation? I didn't begin that conversation in the best way. So what I started to do is soften my approach and just say, this is starting to sound a little AI-ish to me, or this has a lot of the hallmarks or red flags of AI writing. And if these tools can do that now, then we need to distinguish ourselves from that. And even if you, so I use this line a lot, even if you didn't use it, it sounds a lot like it. So it's more important to demonstrate our own connections to these topics using personal examples and talking about our own reflections when it comes to the source material. I'm lucky enough to, I think, have language arts as the topic I teach because I can do a lot of that around
Sure.
personal connections. But if I'm seeing a lot of broad generalizations and summaries of key points and the general statements without really any supporting evidence, then those are the kinds of things I start to push back on. That journey for me has really been about how I talk to learners about it because of I would have used it
Sure.
for
Yeah.
everything when I was a student. Or like,
Sure.
why wouldn't you? Right. I didn't really like school all that much. So I get why they're doing it. I get everybody needs a break. Right. So what I've started to do is develop assignments and rubrics now that kind of disproportionately target and ding AI types of writing where it's looking for those personal connections, or if there are a lot of broad generalizations present, or the words moreover and delve are just like popping up all the time now. So I look for that kind of vocabulary or the perspective and personal voice. That has really been helpful. The other thing I've been doing is creating assignments where I'm just flat out giving them the AI
Mm,
response first and having them analyze that according to a rubric. So they can start to see why it isn't sufficient, like why that isn't what it is. So I was taking assignments that I used to offer up to students as essays, and I was giving that assignment to ChatGPT, to Claude, to Gemini, and and I would have it write the responses, right? And I'll put all those responses next to each other. And then I have students analyze, compare, and contrast all three of those responses, choose one to use that rubric and assign a grade. And then I want to know what they think the red flags of large language model writing is. I want to know what their findings are and their reflection on that experience. So I feel like that one, it lets students know that I
Mhm.
know what it is, and then they're not quite as tempted to try to
Mhm.
get away with it. I think in my message to students, they know I've written books on this stuff. They know I speak about this stuff. So I think I've insulated myself a little bit. I still grade a number of AI submissions every day. It's an easier conversation now than it was before. And some of my pushback and practices even can be a little fun sometimes. Or if a student submits 6 assignments one night, I'll just make a multiple choice quiz out of all 6 of them using ChatGPT and send that to the student and take a quiz on his or her own writing
Interesting.
and see how well they do. And then
Yeah.
usually those conversations don't go very long.
Yeah. So there are a couple of things that you said that I want to call out. One is just the adult approach, right?
Yeah.
Just recognizing that it's an educational opportunity. There's a teachable moment to have conversations around how students are using AI in the classroom and to produce their work. And then it's also you talk about like destigmatizing AI as a taboo thing that you either can or can't use. It's a thing, right? So acknowledging it and then figuring
Right.
out how to make it work for you. The examples,
Well, that has to
yeah,
be it, right? Like we tried to block our
yeah,
way out of
right.
things before, and it is not going away. And that's one of my kind of driving factors into getting heavily involved in this world as early as I could was because no point in
Yeah.
fighting it.
You also give some really good examples of like critical thinking, right? You're using generative AI by having them analyze their work or compare and contrast the AI response, think critically about it, challenge it. Those are higher order thinking skills, right? Those are the things that we want in terms of deeper learning for students. Definitely appreciate that. And then the personal connection piece, a lot of interesting things there. I'm wondering about, so those are deeper learning examples. I wonder about ways that educators might use generative AI to support either students who are neurodiverse, students who are English learners, or just any other profile of student that you have leveraged generative AI for with success.
Yeah, there are a few things I do about that, right? So I might take an existing lesson, plug it into a large language model, and type in some of those student characteristics, right? But I think to take that even a step further, you could take whatever professional development you've had on those topics or go to trusted sources of information or find studies related to those practices that might seem a little overwhelming. And I can, in that context of those chats, I could upload those studies, articles, practices, characteristics, any existing accommodations and modifications that align with those populations or even that particular student that is likely a 504 IEP plan. And I can provide the information about me, my setting, and then I have a conversation, right? A back and forth with the large language model about what my goals are for that learner, and then develop those strategies and how to go about the work. So it can be a really efficient crash course in addressing the needs of certain populations if we think about it as a process, not here's a question I have or make this work for an ELL student. Now, what do I do? You're never going to get a satisfactory response that way. It's still faster. It still saves you time. It's just there's a process involved that isn't just create a lesson, click, and now you've got it, right? That's my biggest fear for all of this is that I've looked at some of these different models that schools are adopting at incredible rates, right? Just to take some of the burden off of teachers. I get the draw for it, but it's really dangerous when I look at some of these tools and I see a button that says lesson plan. And then all you have to do is put in an academic benchmark and click lesson plan, and people are just going to use that. And that's what I have the biggest fear of because there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get something that I would be comfortable putting in front of a student and it's not something that's generated by a large language model.
Okay. So talk about your process a little bit. So you have this conversation, right? And what are some of the things that you do to guard against the factory model?
Well, yeah. So I have my go-to prompts that I'll often use so much that I've even created keyboard shortcuts for getting at them, and so some of them, at least with ChatGPT, can come in the custom instructions. But then if I'm using Claude or Gemini, because a lot of times I go between tools to craft the type of response that I'm looking for. For instance, I was working on developing a lesson for a seventh grade language arts course, and these students are creating these nature journals and they're connecting to the space around them wherever they happen to be in Minnesota. And I wanted a list of poets who write about nature just to use as some source of inspiration and example. And it gave me Ralph Waldo Emerson and a bunch of other white men. That I think a lot of people may not
Mhm.
push back on that. So I go in, I ask it for multiple perspectives. I know that in Minnesota, we have a large Somali population, a large Hmong population, a large Latino population. And I start to ask specifically for different groups, different populations, so students can see examples that
Mm.
reflect them. So when I get those lists, it was missing women largely. So then I have to go in again, and it's a constant pushback for me as part of my process. So now, because I've learned a lot of those things, I can start to do
Mhm.
that by default, right? I can start to ask it in my prompts that I want the tone to provide a demonstration of care for the learner. I want multiple perspectives. I want inclusive language. I'll reference specific SEL frameworks that I want incorporated into these lessons. I'll reference universal design for learning. It's not that they don't have
Sure.
training on these concepts. It's just that you'll never get
Mhm.
them by default, because a default response is something that I think most people are going to be comfortable with. It's going to be the thing that sounds like most people. They don't want a lot of context. They just want something quick and easy. And I don't want that from these tools. I want something more complex. So my process is to continually include these elements that reflect student characteristics, my personal values, my district's values, and then how I can go about that work. So there was a study on emotional prompting, and one of the best prompts they were able to include to get I think it was an 8 to 10% better response across large language models, was to use the phrase, "This task is vital to my career and I greatly value your thorough analysis." And so if you include things like that, you get better responses because you are training the model to recognize that you aren't okay with a default response, that this is something that you need something more for. So we can help direct it into a way that gives us that additional
Okay.
context.
So it's interesting because in the conversation around jobs and how they'll change with AI, whether what jobs will go away, one of the things I hear you saying is that the role of the teacher is not just around design, but it's also around challenging the response that you get back. And it's about the application of however many years of training and experience that they have with students to not accept necessarily what's coming back. Do you see other changes and shifts in kind of the role of the teacher or the educator with large language models?
Yeah, I think there's a perception that these tools can do a lot of that type of work for us. But in my view, I would say that it's demonstrating to us how much our expertise really matters. I haven't always felt like my expertise was that valuable to the public, or even to my students in general might not think about all of the expertise that goes into what gets put in front of them. So if I have a history of 25 years of history of professional development and experiences relating to restorative practices, culture responsive instruction, social emotional learning, accessibility, curriculum design, like that list goes on, right? I've been in this a long time, and I have training in innovation. All of those experiences allow me to recognize when these large language model responses aren't going
Mm.
where I want them to. So that constant skepticism and pushback, allows me to provide the critical eye on these responses that I think is necessary. I don't think that a lot of people are thinking about it that way. I don't think a lot of teachers recognize their own personal value when it comes to providing context and this experience for their learners. I think we are so used to thinking that the content is the thing, right? But it isn't. That's the least important
Hmm,
aspect of all of this.
interesting. So I've heard you talk, and you've talked today, but I've heard you talk before as well about training the bias out of large language model responses. And you've talked about that in terms of the pushback, in terms of using resources specifically to train models. Are there other things that you would say specifically around bias that are really important for educators or anyone in the education field who is using these large language models?
Yeah, I think we have to recognize how this happened in the first place, right? This implicit bias is baked into these models where if we are uploading massive amounts of content that humans have created in order for them to learn from us and sound like us and provide responses that the algorithms show aligns with that user's existing beliefs because that's what people most likely want to see. um, what have we trained it on? If humans are nothing if not biased, right? So if a large body of what we've created is racist, misogynist, homophobic, not inclusive, not representative of multiple perspectives, of course, that's how these responses are going to sound. And we may not even notice it because of our own implicit biases. And we have the programmers themselves who carry their own biases. So there are multiple layers of bias that we have to recognize is just baked into these systems, right? We have never had a new technology that I'm aware of that by default
No.
helps support marginalized populations or learners who are really struggling. This has always been a challenge. And so my concern is that these are maybe going to solidify some of these systemic inequities that we've been trying to dismantle for decades. Taking a response without recognizing the need to push back on them really sets us back. So understanding that first, that's what you're going to get when you're using these tools, but they've also been trained on issues of equity, culturally responsive instruction. So you can ask it in your prompts. I want to be a warm demander. I'm trying to build rapport with my students. This inclusive language and multiple perspectives is important to me. And use those actual phrases while you're building and while you're having these conversations. And you want to have a more representative response that targets your learners. You have to be the one that knows to ask for those kinds of questions. The other thing you're going to get is a bunch of garbage about learning styles or left right brain thinking, these things that have been debunked for decades, but we still like I still took a grad school class on some of those things not all that long ago. Those myths in education are part of these models training too. So you also have to tell it
Mm,
what you don't want. So there's this constant back and forth, what you want, what you don't want, what your values are. And it isn't all going to happen in one prompt, right? So if you're using a tool that says click a lesson, how do you really have a conversation with that in any kind of useful way? It's a process, not just a one click
okay.
solution.
So recognition, awareness, and yeah,
Well,
your and even just self awareness around your own biases and what having a limit.
absolutely. Yeah, and you can have it analyze you too. So one of the things that I think is important is that we upload what we write and what we're doing, our goals, and you have it identify any potential sources of bias because
Mhm.
it can analyze that too and feed it back to you. So maybe using the tool in another way. I do have concerns about, let's say, a new teacher, first, second year teacher coming right out of school. They're overwhelmed, right? We are all overwhelmed right now. And I can't imagine just coming into this profession right now. Like
Mhm.
times are tough. It's very tempting to look to these tools to do some of that heavy lifting for us. And I wonder what it is like. What's this prompting experience, relationship, collaboration like with teachers that don't have a lifetime of experience dealing with systemic inequities? And so we really need collaboration, not just with the large language model, but we need collaboration among other educators who are talking about how they're using these tools and pushing back on each other. Right. So that's been a big part of what I do in the district I work for. There's a team I meet with every week where we're talking about our new practices using AI for curriculum development, and we're pushing back on each other. We are like reviewing each other's stuff. We're reviewing each other's chat threads and just like giving out ideas and information. And I think in the last year, I have had more conversations with educators than I have in the previous
Mhm.
20 plus years. And so these tools, as much as they bug me and that I want them to be better, they've allowed me to actually have real conversations with colleagues that I haven't been able
Yeah.
to have before.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think there's so many examples of how generative AI has been a catalyst for that. If you make the choice to think critically, if you make the choice to prioritize reflection, if you make the choice to prioritize calibration and collaboration with colleagues, right? I think that's an important call out.
Yeah, I don't think that just teaching my English class would have led to me having a
Right?
conversation with you or being at conferences talking to people about what we do in our setting with our student population. So that's the most exciting part for
For
me for
sure.
all of
Yeah,
this.
no, totally appreciate that. You have raised concerns before that instead of reducing burdens for teachers, that AI could actually increase people's workload. So can you say more about that and talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so this kind of hit me this year where the last time I wrote a full year long course, it took me about a full calendar year. Just with it was a lot of effort going back and forth. And with these tools, I will have finished 2 full year-long courses within the course of 1 school year, right? What, 9 and a half, 10 months, right? So I'm more than
Mhm.
twice as efficient as I was before, but not that it all boils down to money. I'm getting paid
Mhm.
less or more than twice as much work. And then I think about this in a couple different ways. One is, should people who can produce more
Mhm.
get more? And the other thing on top of that is, I started using it because I was overwhelmed, because I was stressed, because I felt like I had too much to do. And could these tools lighten my burden a little bit by doing some of that heavy lifting for me, identifying curriculum standards alignment, like that kind of stuff that's tedious and exhausting. And I do that kind of work with these tools. So does that mean because now I am more efficient at using all of these things and I can actually, instead of taking me a week to do a curriculum alignment with academic standards, I could do it in a few hours? Do I just get more work piled on me to take up that space? And I think we're Americans and that's what we do, right? We fill our time with work. We work on weekends, we work on vacations, we work at night, and we just cram work in everywhere we can. And we're always at it, and we never get a chance to just rest or communicate with other people, just the downtime, right? Because now I am able to do a lot of this work faster. At what point does someone discover that and think, "Hey, John has more time. Maybe we should give him this too." And that will break me. I was already
Sure.
almost at that point, and now I finally feel like I had a little bit of relief and know what's coming my way now. And I think that's maybe some fear that a lot of people share, is that we're already worked to the bone. Like, how much is
Great question. One communities are going to have to grapple with. And I think I wonder about some level of standardization of that too, because do you create competition then among communities if in one community you don't get any more work and another one you do? And what does that do
right?
from a competition perspective?
Well, I'm a big fan of the results only work environment, but that doesn't always fly so well when we're talking about contracts that apply to
Right.
thousands of individuals. And we have to take a very standardized approach. And I don't think our school HR departments and our teachers' unions are ready to really have these kinds of conversations.
It's certainly an argument for scalable literacy across districts, right? That it can't be just educators or it can't be just tech departments that are conversations that you
Right.
really at a strategic level, you need folks that have enough fluency to be able to see how it's going to impact different sectors of the district and decision making, right?
We've always had that in education where it was just one more thing, and then nothing ever got taken away. Now, because we're this efficient, could it be 10 more things? And at what point does it just make sense to try to figure out what a realistic set of responsibilities for a specific career
Yeah.
might be? I don't think with teachers we've ever done a good job at that. The more technology we've introduced into classrooms to make us more efficient, the more work we've
Hmm.
had to do.
Hmm. To be continued on that conversation.
Yeah, not to be a big down. I feel like I'm super excited about it, so many of these tools. I use them all every day,
Yeah.
and like a lot of my day, I'm using these tools. So I always feel like I come across as this big downer when I'm talking about how biased they are and these kinds of workload concerns. But it's
Yeah.
real; they're out there. But I'm also still excited about them. But I also understand the realities where we don't have a great track record supporting marginalized populations or learners with disabilities or teachers as a public. Yeah, I want to be realistic, but I'm still really excited about what these tools can
Absolutely.
offer
Yeah. And I
us.
think that and is like the most important thing right now, right? You can be excited and think critic challenge, right?
Yes.
For sure. All right. Last question for you. I don't think we have great
Okay.
models yet for parent education around generative AI. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are and what that might look like.
Yeah, I feel like one one of the things we have to do that I don't think we've done a great job at so far is being
Mm,
transparent. Right? Because we don't have a lot of policies and practices and procedural guidelines around how to use it for educators, we don't have anything to share with parents. And it's just a free for all right now where some people are using them for their own work productivity and some people aren't. But I do think we owe it to parents and the public
mm,
that funds us how these tools are being utilized in schools. I think we really need to educate them about what they are, and i- i- if we're concerned about the biases inherent in these tools, we also have to educate them how we are strategizing and using ways to get around those biases before we put something in front of a learner, or to say that if something is going to go in front of your student or in front of the public, that it has been reviewed by a human
mm.
with expertise before it's been published. We need to develop these practices. But right now, I fear that there are a lot of opinions about AI, and some are warranted and some are just way out there. And I don't think, unless we are talking about that, we're going to do the public a service. The other thing we need to do with the public is talk about some of those factors of an innovative practice so that they don't get so scared off by something that seems really new. I think we can talk about ways in which this already aligns with what we've already been trying to do. We're already trying to make sure that students are learning the content they're supposed to according to academic standards. So here's how we're using AI to ensure that alignment is there. That's more than we've had before. A lot of times we get vendor curriculum, they give us an alignment document for our state that when you really look at it, doesn't really
Mm.
align so well. We can actually do some of that work now and demonstrate how that's happening. And if I'm creating a lesson, the framework for the lesson is still the same. There aren't any really, there are no new concepts coming from large language models. So it really is just about how this is related to what we were already doing. It's just making us more efficient. And or maybe saying that we're piloting some things. I think the word pilot really eases a lot of people's minds. And you can say, we're studying this right now, and then just publish the findings that you're learning from productivity, from student learning. If things aren't improving, students' experiences aren't improving, their learning isn't improving, then you know there's no
Right,
reason to
right.
use it,
No, and then
right?
I think that's the piece that's really important, right, is that impact piece. So the transparency at the outset, the what you're doing, how you're doing it, why you're doing it, and then here's the impact, and here are the decisions we made based on what we learned.
We don't have a great track record in this country of doing
Sure,
that for parents and
sure.
the public, and I really wish that was out there, because when I look at social media feeds, um, I have to shut it off sometimes. I use the block button a lot, where it's a lot of people that think we're the worst, that we're not providing students a service, that things are getting worse, or test scores are going down and it's somehow our fault. I see a lot of comments about teachers only work 9 months, and that's never been the case in my experience. I've never seen a teacher only work 9 months out of the year. These kind of myths about, like, we're a target, and we're only going to create a bigger target on ourselves if there's a perception that we have AI
Sure.
doing work for us, because they already think we get all this time off. They already think all these vacations and winter breaks and spring breaks, that nothing is happening. So if they also think AI is doing my work and could replace me, well, then we have to really be
Yeah.
careful of.
You bring up a good point just in terms of just that transparency and what do the partnerships look like? How I think just
Right.
even um, being transparent about the recognition of the need for increased relevance, right, in education. And I think those are
Yeah.
all things that like our education profession would do well to just be transparent around and be forthcoming about. Given that people since the pandemic have a window into what educators do in a way that they really haven't before. I think that was a huge shift in terms of making visible the work that educators do.
If I'm going to be a target anyway, then I want to be a target for what I'm
Right.
actually doing and not what a perception
Yeah,
about what I'm
absolutely,
doing is.
absolutely. Yeah, for sure. No, I definitely appreciate that. John, any final thoughts that you wanna share before we close today?
Yeah, I do, because I there is such a widespread adoption of these tools and interest in it without the concerns for the things I've been talking about. I am developing resources and materials to share now. So I do have a professional development training site called inclusiveaistrategies.com, and I put the first module up there for free that walks through how these tools are biased, and it just demonstrates and gives examples for the types of biases that exist within these tools. And then each week I'm putting out a module. They're not all going to be free, but that addresses a specific element of how we can think about using these tools, not just in education, but in any type of environment, to prompt for more inclusive and equitable responses, more comprehensive, contextualized responses. I think it's I hope those ideas resonate with people, because I think they're so critically important right
Awesome.
now.
So inclusiveaistrategies.com is where people can find them.
That's right.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise and experience today on the podcast. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me.